On the 20th of July, 1866, First Lieutenant George Templeton, along with 37 souls, began the journey from Fort Reno to Fort Phil Kearny. Under Templeton's command were 20 enlisted men and 9 government teamsters. The rest of the party consisted of other lieutenants, former soldiers, and several wives and children. Second Lieutenant Alexander Wands served as the quartermaster. Ridgway Glover, a photographer who had been sent to take pictures of the 1866 peace treaty proceedings, also joined the group. At noon on the 20th, Lieutenant Templeton and Lieutenant Daniels rode forward to find a camping spot for the party. As the men began to return toward the train, Daniels suddenly noticed they were being set upon by 50 to 60 warriors. Templeton and Daniels tried to make their escape, but Daniels would take an arrow to the back. Templeton faced a close pursuit, making the wagon train as it approached the crossing of the Crazy Woman's Fork. Lieutenant Wands immediately ordered the wagon circled and the party took up defensive positions. The fight on the Crazy Woman would only be a small taste of the fighting yet to come. Join us as we begin our 5th episode of Red Cloud's War, the Fetterman fight.
Well, every road I see leads away from me.
You're listening to the Tales of the Trails podcast, produced by Duke Fraser Productions in association with the 11 Bang Bang YouTube channel. I'm your host, Duke Fraser.
Friend, come see what's round the bend. So is it any wonder that I roam?
The fight on the Crazy Woman would last until dark on the 20th of July. During that time, warriors would continue to harass the soldiers and civilians inside. The wagons were riddled with bullet holes and arrows. Fearing that they would be slain, Lieutenant Wands decided to redeploy the wagon train to a better position a mile away. Placing the women and children in a wagon with mattresses tied to the sideboards for added protection, the party began its move. Lieutenant Henry Link, taking one of the 2 Henry repeaters with the group, managed to snipe a chief giving the signals on a nearby hill. This created confusion amongst the warriors, giving the party an added advantage as they moved positions. Lieutenant Link, along with 12 enlisted men, charged the hill and forced the natives to retreat. As the party reached their destination, they formed a more compact circle, and the men immediately began digging rifle pits. With only 7 rounds per man, the defenders feared a night attack. They placed a rope around the corral as a means of slowing down the attackers. As night approached, Chaplain White and enlisted man William Wallace slipped away to Fort Reno to bring word of the fight and rescue for their companions. As White and Wallace made their run, the group's fortunes improved. Suddenly, the warriors disappeared, and a government caravan came into view. Jim Bridger was in the lead. 34 wagons under escort by Captain Thomas Burroughs and Company G of the 18th U.S. Infantry were proceeding from Fort Reno to Fort Phil Kearny for supplies. They made camp with Templeton's group. At sunrise the next morning, First Lieutenant Thaddeus Kirkland with 20 men from Fort Reno arrived to rescue the party. Chaplain White and Wallace had made Fort Reno in the middle of the night. After recovering Lieutenant Daniels' horribly mutilated body, the party returned to Fort Reno, where Daniels would be buried with full honors. Captain Burroughs would begin his return journey to Fort Phil Kearny on the 23rd of July. During the return venture, Burroughs was informed that a wagon train under command of Hugh Kirkland had come under attack. It had become very apparent to the people traveling the Bozeman Trail that the peace treaty of 1866 was a lie. The Montana Road was not safe passage. CMS Millard wrote that freighters and immigrants should not try the road unless 100 strong and very well armed. Millard also placed blame directly on Colonel Carrington, stating that the man was a perfect booby, coward, and imbecile. As July progressed, the attacks would grow more frequent. The Bozeman Trail was running red with blood. While Red Cloud waged war on the road, Carrington continued to focus on the construction of Fort Phil Kearny. The first item in construction were the palisade walls. Each company was given its own section for construction. Soldiers began digging a long trench in which to place the logs on the 19th of July. The inhabitants of Phil Kearny were forced to sleep in tents. Though Carrington had ordered 2 sawmills, they would not arrive until the end of July. It didn't matter, however. Carrington's primary concern was building the fort's defenses. While some had criticized Carrington for not protecting the Bozeman Trail, Carrington once again informed his commanders of his dire situation. Carrington had 640 men at his command. 560 of those were new recruits. He also possessed no cavalry. He was forced to use mounted infantry that proved ineffective. Upon arriving at Fort Phil Kearny, his soldiers had little more than 50 rounds per man. Target practice for the new recruits was out of the question. The men were armed with muskets, which proved ineffective in fighting Indians. Carrington would remind his superiors of this on nearly a daily basis. On the 27th of August, the acting assistant to the Inspector General for the Department of the Platte, Colonel William Hazen, arrived at Fort Phil Kearny to check Carrington's progress. While Hazen was impressed with the defensive structures being built, he felt that priority should have been given to housing for troops and supplies. In September, Carrington would receive word from General William Sherman informing Carrington that the natives in the Powder River country appeared hostile, and Carrington would be fully supported in his efforts. Later in the month, Carrington would receive 60,000 rounds of Springfield ammunition, only a third of what he needed. Arriving about the same time was Lieutenant George Washington Grummond with his wife Frances. Fighting continued, with attacks nearly on a daily basis. It wasn't until the 1st of November that the cavalry arrived at Fort Phil Kearny. Reinforcing the garrison were 50 men of the 2nd United States Cavalry under Lieutenant Horatio Bingham. 2 days later, Captain William Judd Fetterman would arrive at the post. Fetterman had grown up in a military family and had applied to West Point but was not accepted. He would get a second chance at a military career when he received a commission at the beginning of the Civil War. Fetterman would prove to be very arrogant, having little respect for the natives' abilities in combat. Jim Bridger at one point told Fetterman, "If you ever get into an Indian fight and you are in command, it'll be your first and last fight with the Indians." Fetterman continuously requested of Carrington permission to take the fight to the natives. Supported by Captain Brown and Lieutenant Grummond, Fetterman asked Carrington for 50 mounted infantry and 50 civilians to attack any villages on the Tongue River. Carrington refused, stating the hardships it would cause, not to mention that he didn't have enough mounts for 50 soldiers. The group would press Lieutenant Wands to make the case again to Carrington, but again Carrington refused. Tensions both inside and outside of Fort Phil Kearny would continue to grow. Though Red Cloud continued to keep pressure with constant attacks, it wasn't enough to force the soldiers back to the forts along the Oregon Trail. They needed a larger victory, and they needed it soon. The long-time tactic used by the Plains tribes was to lure the soldiers out of their forts and into an ambush. Yellow Eagle, High Backbone, and Crazy Horse took the lead in organizing the plan. On the 6th of December, High Backbone and Yellow Eagle took around 100 warriors and set up at points along the trail to the woodcutters' camp. Red Cloud and other elders took an overlooked position to relay information to the other warriors with hand signals. At 9 in the morning, a 25-man detail of soldiers and civilian workers left Fort Phil Kearny to make their way to the pinery. By 1 in the afternoon, the message was received that they were under attack. Warriors appeared on Lodge Trail Ridge some 2 miles distant, and the pickets on Pilot Hill were signaling the attack. Carrington decided to take command of the relief column. Carrington planned a pincer movement, with part of the force pushing the warriors away from the woodcutters and the second cutting off their escape. Fetterman, along with Lieutenant Bingham, would take 30 cavalry and relieve the woodcutters. Carrington would lead the force of 21 mounted infantry along with Lieutenant Grummond. 3 orderlies also joined this group. Fetterman would arrive to find the woodcutters under attack by 100 warriors. The attackers immediately fled to the northeast. Carrington had crossed the Big Piney at the west side of Lodge Trail Ridge and was galloping on to meet Fetterman. Fetterman would chase the warriors 5 miles to one of the forks of Pino Creek. Suddenly, Yellow Eagle sprang the trap. Fetterman was surrounded by 150 warriors in an elongated horseshoe formation. For reasons unknown, as Fetterman ordered the halt, Lieutenant Bingham charged back to Fort Phil Kearny, taking 3/4 of the cavalry with him. Brown and Wands stopped 8 soldiers from following and ordered them to dismount at gunpoint. The situation was dire, but soon Carrington's men were seen approaching. The warriors broke off the attack. In a moment of confusion, Carrington assumed Fetterman was joining his command, and when a mile away, turned from Fetterman's command and began to pursue warriors down Pinot Creek. The warriors quickly resumed their siege of Fetterman for another half hour. As Carrington continued pursuit, Lieutenant Drummond and Lieutenant Bingham, who had joined with Drummond after falling back from Fetterman's position, broke off from the main body to pursue a group of 30 warriors. Bingham lost one pistol in the charge and blatantly threw another away in excitement. It soon became clear to Drummond and Bingham that they were surrounded. The group began to fight their way out, but Lieutenant Bingham would be killed and scalped before escaping. Drummond managed to break free from the first group of warriors, but they were quickly surrounded by another. Drummond stated that he just closed his eyes and slashed his way out, his sword clicking every time he cleaved a skull. Sergeant Bauer wouldn't escape the second time. He was pulled from his horse and pierced with an arrow before having his skull cleaved just above his eyes. As Drummond was making his escape, Carrington began to realize the operations was falling apart. He became furious when he was informed that Lieutenant Bingham had left Captain Fetterman and joined Lieutenant Drummond. As Carrington began to recall his troops, warriors began to approach. Their charge was short-lived, as Carrington managed to knock a warrior from the saddle with a single shot. Fetterman had managed to break out and soon made his way to Carrington. As the soldiers regrouped, the warriors began to leave the field. When Fetterman reached Carrington, the question arose of where was Bingham. Soon the command spotted 3 soldiers approaching. It was Lieutenant Drummond and 2 wounded enlisted men. When asked about Bingham, Drummond responded that he was dead, over the hill with 6 others. When the troops come upon the body of Sergeant Bauer, he was still alive and in much agony. A quarter-mile away, they found the body of Lieutenant Bingham. Some 50 arrows filled his body. He had been scalped 3 times, and his face had been repeatedly struck with a hatchet. His ring finger had also been cut from his hand. Bauer's and Bingham's bodies were loaded into an ambulance and taken back to Phil Kearny. Bowers would die in transit. Carrington's first offensive operation ended in failure. Lack of discipline, arrogance, and ignorance of Indian fights could all bear the blame. As the soldiers returned to the fort, the warriors again fired on the woodcutters, sending a clear message they were still there. Shortly after the December 6th fight, down on Pinot Creek, Crazy Mule, a Hamani, rode out from the large encampment of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho blowing a whistle. As he rode across the hill in a zigzag pattern, it became apparent that he was looking for enemy soldiers. He returned to the chiefs in camp and said, "I have 10 soldiers in my hands. Do you want them?" The chiefs declared they were not enough. Again he rode out, returning, declaring that he had 20. The chiefs were still not satisfied. When he returned with 50, the chiefs would say no again. He rode out one final time. He returned to the chiefs and fell from his horse, declaring, "I have 100 in my hands." The camp was suddenly filled with war whoops. The plan was set in motion. Decoys would lure the troops across Lodge Trail Ridge, where they would spring the ambush. 6 Lakota, including Crazy Horse, Sword, and American Horse, 2 Cheyenne, Big Nose and Wolf Left Hand, and 2 Arapaho, Black Coal and Eagle Head, would act as the decoys. As daylight broke out on the morning of the 21st of December, the warriors set out from camp. The tribes rode separately. As they arrived at the forks of Pinot Creek, the Lakota asked the Cheyennes which side of the ridge they wished to take. The Cheyenne chose the west slope, and they were joined by the Arapaho. Most of the Lakota would take the other side. It had been determined that the Cheyenne Little Horse, the contrary warrior, would tell the warriors when to charge. Little Horse wore the sacred buffalo hat, which was a great spiritual object to the northern Cheyenne. At 9 a.m., the warriors began a general harassment of the fort. The surgeon's orderly, tending to a cow outside the fort walls, was set upon by 25 warriors. The fort musicians began to fire on the warriors, and Carrington fired 3 shells from the 12-pound mountain howitzer. Little Chief and Sorrel Horse attacked the livestock herds. Despite the harassment, the wood train left at 10 a.m. With the activity of the morning, Carrington increased the guards, bringing the total men on the train to nearly 90. When the wagon train had traveled 1.5 miles, 30 warriors attacked. The wagons were quickly corralled and the stocks led safely inside. The wagon train managed to hold off the warriors, and after a short time resumed its trek, loading timber for firewood as quickly as possible. Carrington received word that the wood train had corralled at 11 a.m. He immediately began the preparations for a relief column. He selected Captain James Powell to lead the relief column, but Captain Fetterman objected. Fetterman was the senior officer of the regiment, and Carrington gave him the command of the detail. Fetterman would select 49 men of companies A, C, E, and H of the 18th Infantry. Fetterman began his march within 15 minutes. Carrington's orders to Fetterman were clear and to the point. Relieve the wood train and return. Do not cross over Lodge Trail Ridge. As Fetterman moved out from the fort, Carrington ordered Lieutenant Grumman to take command of the detail of 27 men of Company C of the 2nd Cavalry. Grumman was given instructions to repeat Carrington's orders to Fetterman, emphasizing the order not to cross the ridge. Carrington repeated the orders to Grumman just outside the fort walls. Included with the column were civilians James Wheatley and Isaac Fisher. Both were armed with Henry repeating rifles. Unknown to Carrington, Captain Brown had snuck out of the fort without orders to join the column. Carrington watched as the 2 commands joined at the crossing of Piney Creek. When Fetterman began marching up the slope of Lodge Trail Ridge, he assumed it was an attempt to cut off the warriors as they withdrew. At 11:45, Carrington had received word that Fetterman had crossed Lodge Trail Ridge. As Carrington glassed the ridge, he could not see any movement, but the sound of gunfire was rapidly increasing. As Fetterman's command had crossed Piney Creek, he immediately spotted the decoy party. The attack on the wood train had ceased, and this small group of warriors proved too tempting. Fetterman pursued the decoys, with the cavalry moving ahead and the infantry close behind. The command pursued the warriors for 3 miles along Lodge Trail Ridge, finally crossing it where it met with a perpendicular ridge that led north. The soldiers slowly progressed down the ridge, the cavalry in the lead and the infantry further behind. When the cavalry reached the forks of Pino Creek, the decoys split. The contrary warrior Little Horse gave the signal. Like a sudden thunder, the warriors sprang the trap. Thunderhawk, a Menoconjou, was the first to strike an enemy and counted the first coup. As the warriors began to pour arrows into the soldiers, the infantry took back and sought shelter in a group of rocks. The cavalry moved further back, taking a position 100 yards above the infantry. As the warriors charged upon the infantry soldiers, it became an intense battle of hand-to-hand combat. In the chaos, several of the natives were wounded and killed by stray arrows of their comrades. The fight with the infantry was completed in short order. 3 surviving soldiers jumped from the rocks and began running to the cavalry. They were cut down in short order. Now the warriors turned their attention to the cavalry troops. The slick snow and ice and the steep slope made the charge difficult for the warriors. Wandering Buffalo Bull stated the arrows in the sky were like many grasshoppers flying across each other. Grumman encouraged the men, waving his saber. At one point during the battle, he had decapitated a warrior with a single blow from the blade. Despite his bravery, he was struck by a warrior, the blow of the club crushing his skull. As Grumman fell, the remaining cavalry troops began falling back up the hill. White Bull charged one of the soldiers that was waving a carbine, put an arrow through the man's heart. At the upper end of the ridge was another pile of rocks. The soldiers released what horses they had left and took shelter. The soldiers, armed with Spencer repeating carbines, put up a longer fight from this defensive position. Many warriors were wounded as they crawled towards the soldiers. As the warriors crept up in mass, like they had done with the infantry, they swarmed the remaining cavalry soldiers. As the warriors crowded upon the soldiers, one trooper took a hold of a Lakota warrior by the braids and killed him with his sidearm. Adolf Metzger, a 32-year-old bugler of Company C, died bravely, using his bugle as a club against the warriors. The last man to be killed was a soldier that had played dead. As a warrior approached him, he raised his revolver and fired. He was soon killed. Red Cloud, an American horse, later told that the officers fought bravely that day. The Oglala American horse had killed Fetterman, striking him on the head with a club and then finishing him off with his knife. Though the soldiers were dead, the warriors were not finished. They had defeated them in this life, and now they went to work to ensure their defeat in the next. As the gunfire from Lodge Trail Ridge rang through the walls of Fort Phil Kearny, Carrington ordered Captain Ten Eyck to prepare to march and ordered all remaining soldiers of Company C, 2nd Cavalry to report. He then ordered the garrison put under arms. Ten Eyck was ordered to take 36 men of the 18th Infantry, 25 of the 2nd Cavalry, and 42 armed teamsters. 3 wagons loaded with 3,000 rounds of Springfield and 2 cases of Spencer ammunition, along with an ambulance and 2 surgeons, also joined the command. Ten Eyck left the fort at 12:15. The soldiers under Ten Eyck's command marched in double time. They followed the Bozeman Trail, the quickest route to Fetterman. As Ten Eyck approached the ridge, he rode to the highest point to the right of the road, which gave the best commanding view of the valley below. By now, the firing, which had lasted almost 40 minutes, had ceased. Ten Eyck sent word back to Carrington that he could not see Fetterman, but there were thousands of Indians and requested Carrington to send a howitzer. Private Lewis noticed a group of white objects laying on the ground down the ridge and pointed them out to Ten Eyck. Ten Eyck gazed in horror as he shouted, "Boys, this is what we're looking for." Next time on Tales of the Trails, Captain Tenador Ten Eyck recovers the bodies of Fetterman's defeated command. John Portuguese Phillips makes a bold and daring ride to carry word of the Fetterman's defeat to Fort Laramie. Searching for a scapegoat, the Army relieves Carrington the command.
All the places I have been.
Tales of the Trails is produced by Duke Frazier Productions. Music performed by Garrett Woods from the 11 Bang Bang YouTube channel. Sources for this episode may be found in the description field below. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button and be sure to subscribe. Click the bell to receive notification of new episodes. Until next time, keep your powder dry.
Calls me as it goes.